The lecture hall fell silent as the door creaked open. Professor Margaret Wilson paused mid-sentence, her chalk hovering over the blackboard where a complex economic theory sprawled in her precise handwriting. 200 students turned in unison, their attention shifting from the elegant equations to the disheveled young man standing in the doorway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was 9:43 on a Tuesday morning, and Thomas Reed had just walked into a lecture he had no right to attend. His faded jeans were splattered with paint, his dark hair untamed, and his eyes, piercing blue and unnervingly focused, scanned the room with the intensity of someone searching for something long lost. "I'm sorry," Professor Wilson said, her voice steady despite her surprise. "Can I help you?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stood frozen, absorbing the familiar scent of chalk dust and old books that permeated Wallace Hall. 3 years had passed since he'd last stepped foot in this building, yet nothing had changed. Not the worn wooden podium, not the sunlight filtering through tall windows, not the expectant silence of students waiting for wisdom to be dispensed. "I need to say something," he finally replied, his voice carrying across the hall with unexpected clarity. "About your theory on behavioral economics and market failure." A murmur rippled through the crowd of students. Professor Wilson's reputation for intellectual rigor meant few dared challenge her, certainly not unannounced visitors interrupting her flagship lecture series. "And you are?" she asked, placing her chalk down and wiping her hands on her tweed jacket. "Thomas Reed. I was your student 3 years ago." Recognition flickered across her face. Not just any student, her most promising one. The one who had disappeared without explanation midway through his second year, leaving behind nothing but rumors and a half-finished thesis that had shown extraordinary promise. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softening slightly. "This is an unexpected surprise. However, I'm in the middle of—" "Your equation is wrong," Thomas interrupted, stepping further into the room. "Not technically wrong, but incomplete. It doesn't account for human irrationality during sustained periods of uncertainty." Another wave of whispers swept through the hall. Professor Wilson's theories on behavioral economics had recently been published in the leading journals, praised for their elegant bridging of psychological factors with traditional economic models. No one questioned them, at least not in her own lecture hall. "That's quite a claim," she said, her academic curiosity momentarily overriding her annoyance at the interruption. "Perhaps we could discuss this after class." Thomas shook his head, moving toward the center aisle. "I've been testing your theory in real life, not in laboratories or controlled studies. In actual markets, with real people making real decisions when they have nothing left to lose." The room grew quieter still. Professor Wilson studied him carefully, his worn backpack, the fatigue etched into his face, the intensity in his eyes that bordered on desperation. This wasn't the polished, brilliant student she remembered. This was someone transformed by experiences she couldn't begin to imagine. "You have 5 minutes," she said, gesturing to the front of the room. "Then I need to continue my lecture." Thomas nodded, dropping his backpack by the stairs. As he approached the blackboard, students leaned forward. Even those scrolling mindlessly on phones tucked them away, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. He picked up a piece of chalk, its weight familiar in his hand. For a moment he stared at the elaborate equations Professor Wilson had written, tracing them with his eyes. Then, without hesitation, he began to write alongside them, adding variables, connecting threads she had left separate, building upon her foundation, something entirely new. His handwriting was less precise than hers, but there was an urgency to it, a raw energy that made the mathematical symbols seem almost alive. As he wrote, He began to speak. 3 years ago, I sat in this room believing economics could be perfected. If we just found the right equations, he said, chalk scratching against board, that human behavior could be predicted, mapped, and quantified if our models were sophisticated enough. Professor Wilson watched him, her expression unreadable. The students remained transfixed. Then I lost everything, Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. My scholarship was revoked when my mother got sick. I couldn't afford tuition and her medical bills. I had to choose Harvard or her survival. It wasn't much of a choice. His chalk never stopped moving, adding layer upon layer to Wilson's equations. I worked 3 jobs, day trading with what little money I had left, living in my car between shifts, and I started seeing patterns your equations don't capture, patterns that emerge when people are pushed to extremes, when traditional risk assessment breaks down because survival itself is at stake. The room was absolutely silent now. Even Professor Wilson had moved closer to the board, studying his additions with growing interest. Your models assume a baseline of security that millions of people don't have, Thomas said. They assume rational choices exist for everyone. But what I discovered is that economic behavior under sustained duress follows entirely different rules. Rules that explain market anomalies your current equations dismiss as statistical noise. He stepped back from the board, revealing an elaborate expansion of Wilson's theory, one that incorporated new variables representing desperation, survival instinct, and community interdependence during economic crisis. This isn't theoretical for me, he said, turning to face the room. I've lived in the gaps of your equations for 3 years, and what I found there matters, not just academically, but for real people trying to survive in systems that weren't built for them. Professor Wilson approached the board slowly, studying his additions with the careful scrutiny of someone who had dedicated her life to the pursuit of theoretical precision. The silence stretched as she traced her fingers over his work, following his logic, testing it against her own understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Where did you gather your data? Thomas reached for his backpack, pulling out a worn notebook filled with cramped handwriting, charts, and observations. Homeless shelters, food banks, community centers, day labor sites. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Places where economics isn't theoretical. He opened the notebook to a particularly dense section of annotations. I interviewed over 400 people facing economic crisis, tracked their decision-making patterns, and mapped them against market fluctuations in their communities. Professor Wilson took the notebook, handling it with unexpected reverence. She flipped through pages of meticulous observations, raw data, and hand-drawn graphs, the kind of real-world research most academics only claim to value. You've been conducting a longitudinal study while homeless yourself, she said, not a question, but a realization. Thomas nodded. The most accurate observations come from within, not from behind glass. Professor Wilson turned to the class, her academic composure momentarily fractured by genuine emotion. What Mr. Reed has just demonstrated, she said, her voice less steady than before, is something I've spent decades trying to teach. That true innovation doesn't come from repeating established patterns, but from questioning their foundations, from seeing what others have overlooked. She turned back to Thomas, seeing him fully now, not just the brilliant mind she had once known, but the human being who had suffered, persevered, and transformed that suffering into insight. May I? She asked, gesturing to the chalk. When he handed it to her, She added her own notations to his work, extending it further, engaging with his ideas not as interruptions, but as essential additions to her life's work. "Your approach changes everything," she said quietly, then addressing the class, but looking at Thomas. "Sometimes it takes someone outside the system to show us its blind spots." What happened next would be recounted differently by everyone who were present. Some would say Professor Wilson simply offered Thomas a position on her research team. Others would insist she publicly acknowledged the limitations of her own work. The most dramatic accounts claimed she wept openly, though most agreed it was more subtle, a momentary glistening of eyes quickly controlled. What no one disputed was that Thomas Reed's interruption had permanently altered the trajectory of her research, and that the conversation they began that day would eventually lead to a revolutionary framework for understanding economic behavior during times of social crisis. But before all that, before the published papers and research grants and eventual return to Harvard on very different terms, there was just a former student with nothing left to lose, a professor willing to listen, and a roomful of witnesses, to the rare moment when academia's careful walls crumbled just enough to let real life pour through. "You should sit down," Professor Wilson finally said, gesturing to an empty seat in the front row. "We have a lot to discuss, and I believe my students would benefit from hearing more about your research." As Thomas took his seat, the energy in the room shifted. This was no longer just a lecture. It was something far more valuable, a genuine exchange between different worlds, different experiences, different ways of knowing. And for many students present, it was the first time they witnessed the raw power of lived experience to transform theoretical understanding. Before we jump back in, Professor Wilson addressed the class, setting down her chalk. "I want to acknowledge what just happened. Mr. Reed has demonstrated something essential about knowledge creation, that it doesn't happen in isolation. That, sometimes, the most important insights come from unexpected sources, from lives lived very differently from our own." She turned to Thomas, her professional demeanor softened by newfound respect. "Would you be willing to explain how you first noticed the pattern?" she asked. "The moment when you realized the established theories were insufficient?" Thomas nodded, glancing around at the suddenly attentive faces of students who moments earlier had been mindlessly taking notes. "It started at a day labor pickup site in Dorchester," he began. "I was standing with about 30 other people at 5 a.m., hoping to get work. Construction, moving, whatever paid cash that day. Most economists would predict competitive behavior. In that situation, limited resources, high need, but what I observed repeatedly was the opposite." The students leaned forward, textbooks forgotten, as Thomas described how workers would share information about which contractors paid fairly, which jobs were worth the strain, which sites to avoid, how they would split opportunities and earnings when someone was in dire need, how community survival repeatedly trumped individual gain, creating microeconomies that defied traditional models. "I started tracking these patterns," he continued, "mapping them against larger market trends, and I realized they weren't anomalies, they were consistent responses to sustained uncertainty. But they only become visible when you're immersed in them, when you're not just studying poverty, but experiencing it." Professor Wilson nodded, clearly affected by both his words and the implications for her own work. "Theory divorced from lived. Reality becomes dangerously incomplete," she said, speaking both to Thomas and to her students. "This is why diversity of experience in academia isn't just about representation. It's about the integrity of our knowledge itself." As the conversation continued, the original lecture plan was abandoned. Instead, professor and former student engaged in a real-time collaboration, building upon each other's insights, challenging assumptions, drawing connections between theoretical frameworks and lived experience. Students who had come expecting to passively receive information found themselves witnessing the raw, messy, exhilarating process of knowledge creation. Many would later describe this class as the moment they understood what education could be, at its best. Not the transmission of established facts, but the collaborative exploration of emerging truths. When the class period ended, no one moved. The typical rush to pack up and leave was replaced by a collective reluctance to break the spell of authentic intellectual engagement. Finally, Professor Wilson addressed the unusual situation. "I think we've all experienced something significant today," she said. "Mr. Reed has reminded us that the purpose of education isn't to confirm what we already believe, but to confront us with perspectives we haven't considered." She turned to Thomas, making a decision that would alter both their futures. "I would like to formally invite you to join my research team," she said. "Not as a student, but as a collaborator. Your fieldwork is precisely what our theoretical models have been missing." Thomas looked stunned. "I don't have a degree," he said. "I didn't even finish sophomore year." Professor Wilson smiled slightly. "Sometimes the most valuable credentials aren't the ones that hang on walls," she replied. "You've conducted research most PhD candidates couldn't imagine, let alone execute. The insights you've developed have more real-world validity than many peer-reviewed papers." She gestured to his notebook. "That's worth more to me than any transcript." In the back of the lecture hall, someone began to applaud. Others joined until the room filled with the sound of appreciation, not just for Thomas, but for what they had all witnessed, the moment when authentic human experience broke through academic formality to reveal a deeper truth. As students, finally, began gathering their things, murmuring excitedly among themselves, Professor Wilson turned back to the blackboard, studying the new equations that now intertwined with her own. "You know," she said quietly, "I've spent 20 years developing these models, published dozens of papers, received international recognition." She traced one of Thomas's additions with her finger. "And in 15 minutes, you've shown me their fundamental limitation." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, suddenly aware that he might have overstepped. She shook her head. "Don't be. This is what real scholarship looks like, being willing to have your best thinking challenged, especially by voices you weren't expecting to hear." She turned to face him fully. "The question is, what do we do now?" Thomas looked around the lecture hall, a place that had once represented everything he aspired to before life took him on a very different journey. "We rebuild the model," he said simply, "not just yours or mine. Something new that holds both perspectives, the theoretical and the lived." Professor Wilson nodded, something like hope flickering across her face. "Yes," she agreed. "That's exactly what we do." As they gathered their papers, continuing their discussion in lowered voices, neither fully grasped the significance of what had just happened, how this unexpected intersection of different worlds would eventually reshape not just economic theory, but the university's approach to knowledge creation itself. Outside Wallace Hall, the campus continued its pristine, privileged routine, but inside, something had shifted. A door had opened between academia's theoretical realm and the messy reality beyond its walls, and neither would be quite the same again. Word spread quickly across Harvard's campus. By evening, the story had been retold dozens of times, each version more dramatic than the last. Students who hadn't been present claimed they were. Those who had actually witnessed the exchange described it with the reverence usually reserved for historical moments, which, in the insular world of academia, perhaps it was. Professor Margaret Wilson's office had never seen so much traffic. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged her in faculty meetings suddenly found urgent reasons to stop by. Graduate students hovered in the hallway, hoping for glimpses of Thomas Reed, the dropout who had challenged one of Harvard's most formidable minds and somehow earned her respect. Inside the office, Thomas sat uncomfortably in an antique leather chair, surrounded by books and accolades that reminded him of everything he had walked away from 3 years ago. The contrast between this wood-paneled sanctuary and the shelter, where he'd slept last night, couldn't have been starker. "They're treating this like a spectacle," Professor Wilson said, closing the door on yet another curious colleague. "I apologize for that." Thomas shrugged. "People love stories about outsiders disrupting the system, even when they are the system." Professor Wilson smiled slightly, recognizing the truth in his observation. She settled behind her desk, studying him with the careful attention she typically reserved for complex data sets. "Your work is remarkable," she said, tapping his notebook, which lay open between them. "Not just the insights, but the methodology. You've created an entirely new approach to field research in behavioral economics." Thomas shifted in his seat. Praise felt foreign after years of invisibility. "It wasn't intentional research at first, just observations to help me survive." "That's precisely what makes it valuable," she replied. "You weren't testing preconceived hypotheses. You were documenting reality as it unfolded around you and within you." She leaned forward, her academic detachment giving way to genuine curiosity. "Tell me about your journey since leaving Harvard, the complete version, not just what you shared in lecture." Thomas looked out the window at the immaculate campus grounds, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was measured, as if recounting someone else's life. "After my mum got sick, I tried everything to stay enrolled. Multiple jobs, loan applications, emergency funding requests. But Harvard's financial aid system isn't designed for sudden catastrophes. It's built for predictable hardship, documented in advance." Professor Wilson nodded, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. Like most faculty, she had limited engagement with the university's financial mechanisms. "When I realized I couldn't make it work, I withdrew formally to avoid failing grades. Thought I'd come back when things stabilized." A humorless smile crossed his face. "That was optimistic." He described the rapid descent that followed, how quickly 3 months of emergency savings vanished into medical bills and rent. How his mother's condition deteriorated despite treatments they could barely afford. How the safety net he had always assumed existed revealed itself to be more theoretical than real. "After she died, there was nothing tethering me to any particular place. I stayed mobile because it was cheaper than paying rent." He gestured to his backpack. "Everything I own fits in there. Makes data collection easier." Professor Wilson listened without interruption, her expression increasingly troubled. This wasn't simply a story about economic hardship. It was a profound indictment of systems she had participated in without questioning. "When did the research become intentional?" she finally asked. "About 8 months in," Thomas replied. "I was at a community kitchen in Somerville, talking with other people in similar situations. I started noticing patterns in how they made economic decisions, patterns that contradicted everything I'd learned here." He pulled several folded papers from his pocket, spreading them on her desk. They were covered with intricate diagrams, mapping decision trees, risk assessments, and community resource allocation mechanisms that emerged spontaneously among people in crisis. These communities develop complex economic systems that operate on principles completely different from mainstream models, he explained, his voice gaining momentum. "They're not based on maximizing individual gain, but on collective resilience. Not on accumulation, but on circulation. When resources are scarce and survival is at stake, people create entirely different frameworks for value and exchange." Professor Wilson studied the diagrams, her academic mind processing the implications. "And you documented these systematically, across different communities?" Thomas nodded. 7 major urban centers, dozens of communities within each. I followed seasonal labor patterns, traveled by bus when I could afford it, hitchhiked when I couldn't, spent time in encampments, shelters, food banks, day labor sites, undocumented worker communities. He pulled out more notes, pages of interviews, observations, statistical patterns tracked over time. I started seeing the same structures emerge independently in completely different locations. That's when I knew it wasn't coincidental. These are adaptive responses to economic precarity that our current models don't account for. Professor Wilson was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing one of the diagrams. When she finally looked up, there was something new in her expression. Not just intellectual engagement, but a dawning recognition of broader implications. "Thomas," she said quietly, "this isn't just an expansion of existing theory. This is a fundamental challenge to how we conceptualize economic behavior itself." He met her gaze steadily. "That's why I came back. Not to study here again, that's not possible for me now. But because these insights needed to reach people who could incorporate them into their understanding of economics, people like you." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, the acknowledgement that he had returned not as a student seeking readmission, but as a researcher bringing critical knowledge from worlds the university rarely acknowledged. "What are your circumstances now?" Professor Wilson asked carefully. "Where are you staying?" Thomas hesitated. "I have arrangements, places I can sleep safely." "That's not what I asked." He looked away. "I've been at the Pine Street shelter for the past week. Before that, camping along the Charles. I move between options depending on weather, availability, safety considerations." Professor Wilson removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. The abstract theoretical challenge was suddenly uncomfortably human. "And yet you found time to track down my lecture schedule and prepare a comprehensive critique of my work," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Your work matters," Thomas replied simply. "It influences policy, shapes how future economists understand human behavior. Getting these insights to you matters more than my temporary comfort." Professor Wilson stood abruptly, walking to the window. For several minutes she stared out at the campus, her back to Thomas, seemingly lost in thought. When she turned, her academic reserve had been replaced by something more decisive. "I'm going to be very direct," she said. "Harvard has resources that could have prevented your withdrawal in the first place. Resources that exist precisely for situations like yours. The fact that you didn't receive them represents a systemic failure, one that I've been complicit in by never questioning how these systems actually function." She returned to her desk, pulling out a drawer. "I can't change what happened 3 years ago, but I can ensure your research continues and reaches the audience it deserves." From the drawer, she withdrew a set of keys and a department card. "The economics department maintains a visiting scholar apartment in Peabody Terrace. It's normally reserved for international faculty, but it's currently unoccupied. It's yours for the next 3 months while we formalize your research position." Thomas stared at the keys, not reaching for them. "I didn't come here for charity." This isn't charity," Professor Wilson replied firmly. "It's infrastructure for essential research. Your work on economic behavior under sustained precarity has significant academic value. I'm securing appropriate resources for its continuation." She placed the keys and card on his notebook. "You can accept these as professional accommodations or leave them on the desk. But know that if you walk out that door without them, the insights you've developed, insights that could reshape how we understand economic behavior during crisis, may never reach the people who need to hear them." It was a masterful academic maneuver, framing basic needs as research requirements, appealing not to his personal circumstances, but to the importance of his work. Thomas recognized the strategy and almost smiled despite himself. "That's manipulative," he said. "That's pragmatic," she corrected, "and entirely consistent with your own findings about resource allocation in community settings. When a resource serves collective knowledge, individual hesitation becomes secondary." For the first time that day, Thomas laughed, a genuine sound that momentarily transformed his weathered face. "Using my own research against me. That's very Harvard." Professor Wilson didn't deny it. Instead, she pushed a form across the desk. "This is a formal appointment as a research fellow in the Behavioral Economics program. It comes with a stipend, access to department resources, and the expectation that you'll collaborate on developing these insights into publishable work." Thomas looked from the form to Professor Wilson, searching her face for signs of pity or condescension. He found none, only the intense focus of a scholar who recognized valuable research when she saw it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Finally. Really?" Professor Wilson considered the question carefully. "3 reasons," she said. "First, your research genuinely advances the field in ways I haven't seen before. Second, I believe the university has an obligation to support knowledge creation, regardless of conventional credentials. And third," she paused, choosing her words with uncharacteristic care, "I've spent 20 years studying economic behavior without ever experiencing the conditions I theorize about. That's produced blind spots in my work that your perspective illuminates." She met his gaze directly. "In other words, I need your insights as much as you need institutional support to develop them. This isn't charity, it's intellectual necessity." The honesty of her assessment cut through Thomas's remaining resistance. He reached for the keys, his decision made not from desperation, but from recognition of mutual benefit. Exactly the kind of exchange mechanism he had documented in his research. 3 months, he said. "We'll see what we can develop in that time." Professor Wilson nodded, extending her hand formally. "Welcome back to Harvard, Mr. Reed, on very different terms." As they shook hands, neither fully grasped how this unusual partnership would reshape not just their understanding of economics, but the university's approach to knowledge creation itself. What had begun as an interruption was becoming something far more significant, a fundamental challenge to who could produce knowledge and under what conditions. News of Thomas's appointment spread through the department with mixed reactions. Some faculty welcomed the innovative approach, others questioned the precedent of appointing someone without credentials. Graduate students were similarly divided. Some fascinated by his unconventional methodology, others resentful of his circumvention of traditional academic pathways. Dr. Lawrence Harrington, the department chair, summoned Professor Wilson to his office the following day. His displeasure was evident before she even sat down. "Margaret, this is highly irregular," he began, tapping a copy of Thomas's appointment form. "A research fellowship for someone who hasn't even completed undergraduate studies? It raises serious questions about standards." Professor Wilson had anticipated this resistance. "Lawrence, when Einstein published his theory of relativity, he was working as a patent clerk. His lack of academic position didn't make his insights less valuable." "That's hardly comparable." "Isn't it?" she interrupted. "Thomas has developed a methodological approach to studying economic behavior that no one in this department has considered. The fact that he did so without institutional support makes it more impressive, not less." Harrington frowned. "There are procedures, Margaret. Admissions committees, application processes, standards that maintain the integrity of our research. Community. Standards that also exclude certain forms of knowledge," she countered. "Thomas has conducted field research under conditions none of us would voluntarily experience. The insights he's developed couldn't have emerged from traditional academic pathways. She leaned forward, adjusting her strategy. Lawrence, you've built your career advocating for methodological innovation. This is exactly that, a new approach to data collection and theory development emerging from lived experience rather than controlled experiments. The appeal to his own academic identity had the intended effect. Harrington's expression shifted from outright opposition to cautious consideration. "You're staking considerable professional capital on this," he noted. Professor Wilson nodded. "I am, because I believe his work represents a significant advance in our understanding of economic behavior under conditions of extreme constraint, conditions that are increasingly common and critically understudied." After further discussion, Harrington reluctantly approved the appointment with one condition. Thomas would present his research methodology to the full department within 2 weeks. The unspoken implication was clear. This would be a test, not just of Thomas's insights, but of Professor Wilson's judgment in supporting them. When she relayed this requirement to Thomas, he was unfazed. Academic hazing ritual. Essentially, she admitted, they need to confirm you're a legitimate researcher, not just someone with an interesting personal story. He nodded, already planning his approach. "I'll need access to statistical analysis software to properly visualize the patterns I've documented." "You'll have everything you need," she assured him, "including my support. But understand that some faculty will be actively looking for reasons to discredit your methodology." Thomas smiled faintly. "Professor Wilson, I've defended my right to exist in spaces far more hostile than a Harvard seminar room. This will be challenging, but not threatening." His confidence wasn't bravado. It was the hard-earned resilience of someone who had navigated systems designed to exclude him. Professor Wilson realized that while she could offer institutional support, he brought strengths developed precisely because of his exclusion from institutions like Harvard. In the days that followed, Thomas settled into an unsettling new reality. The visiting scholar apartment was modest by Harvard standards, but luxurious compared to his recent accommodations. A clean, private space with reliable heat, a shower, a small kitchen, and most importantly, large tables where he could spread out his notes and begin organizing 3 years of research. He worked methodically, 16 hours a day, fueled by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his mother's illness. Each page of observations, each diagram, each statistical pattern was carefully digitized, analyzed, and incorporated into a comprehensive framework, documenting how economic behavior transformed under conditions of extreme precarity. Professor Wilson visited daily, sometimes bringing colleagues she trusted. These informal sessions became impromptu seminars, as Thomas explained how community-based resource allocation systems emerged spontaneously among people with no formal economic training. Systems that prioritized collective survival over individual advantage in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions of traditional economic theory. The most interesting patterns appeared in mixed resource communities, Thomas explained one evening, pointing to a complex network diagram. When some members had occasional access to formal employment, while others relied on alternative subsistence strategies, they developed sophisticated resource-sharing mechanisms that maximized collective stability. Professor Eliza Chen, a specialist in game theory who had initially been skeptical, studied the diagram with growing interest. This contradicts standard assumptions about competitive behavior under scarcity, she noted. Thomas nodded. Because those assumptions presume individualized risk. What I observed repeatedly was the recognition that individual survival was dependent on community resilience. This fundamentally alters the calculation of self-interest. Professor Chen looked up from the diagram. You're essentially describing an alternative rationality, not irrationality, as conventional economics might classify these behaviors, but a different form of rationality based on different foundational assumptions. Exactly, Thomas said, the validation from another senior academic clearly meaningful to him. It's not that people make poor economic choices under duress. It's that they're operating within an entirely different economic framework with different definitions of value, risk, and return. As the presentation date approached, Thomas's work gained supporters beyond Professor Wilson. 3 other faculty members had recognized the significance of his methodology and findings, offering their own perspectives and helping strengthen his analytical framework. Even some graduate students had overcome their initial resentment, drawn in by the originality of his approach. 2 days before the scheduled presentation, Thomas was working late in the department library when a maintenance worker approached. His table. The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable in the academic space, before speaking quietly. "You're him, right? The guy who was homeless and came back to challenge the professors?" Thomas looked up, surprised. News travels fast. The man shrugged. "My daughter works in the cafeteria. Everyone's talking about it." He glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "Is it true you were studying how people like us handle money when times get rough?" The question revealed how stories transform in circulation, Thomas's complex research reduced to its most accessible element. Yet the man's interest was genuine, his people like us creating an immediate connection between them. "That's part of it," Thomas replied. "I was documenting economic systems that develop outside formal markets, how people share resources, make decisions, create safety nets when traditional systems fail them." The man nodded. "Like how we trade shifts at work, or pool money for someone's emergency, or warn each other about predatory check-cashing places." "Exactly like that," Thomas said, struck by how easily this man grasped concepts that had required elaborate explanation for Harvard faculty. Those networks and knowledge-sharing systems are sophisticated economic structures that mainstream economics doesn't recognize or value. The conversation continued for several minutes, the maintenance worker offering examples from his own community that perfectly illustrated Thomas's research findings. When he finally left, he smiled slightly. "Good luck showing them what's real. Sometimes the hardest people to teach are the ones who think they already know everything." The interaction remained with Thomas as he finalized his presentation. It reinforced what had driven him to return to Harvard in the first place, not personal vindication, but the conviction that these overlooked economic realities needed to be understood by those who shaped economic policy and education. The morning of the presentation arrived with a tension that permeated the economics department. The seminar room filled beyond capacity, not just with economics faculty and students, but professors from sociology, anthropology, and public policy programs who had heard about the unusual presentation. Professor Harrington opened the session with a brief, carefully neutral introduction that neither endorsed nor dismissed Thomas's work. As he yielded the floor, the room settled into an expectant silence. Thomas stood at the podium, dressed simply in clothes borrowed from a department. Fund for students in need. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even his ability to appear professional for this presentation depended on institutional resources that had been unavailable to him 3 years ago. He began not with academic jargon or theoretical positioning, but with a story, the same one he had shared with Professor Wilson about the day labor site in Dorchester. But this time, he connected it explicitly to economic theory, highlighting how the cooperative behaviors he observed contradicted standard models of competition under resource scarcity. From there, he methodically presented his research process, How? He had identified patterns, developed hypotheses, tested them across different communities, and documented consistent findings. His approach was rigorous despite its unconventional setting, his analysis sophisticated despite his lack of advanced training. As he spoke, the initial skepticism in the room gradually shifted. Even those who had come expecting to witness an academic failure found themselves engaged with the substance of his findings. Findings that challenged fundamental assumptions about rational choice, market behavior, and economic decision-making under conditions of extreme constraint. What I've documented, Thomas concluded, is not an aberration or exception to economic principles, but an alternative economic framework that emerges when conventional systems fail to meet basic needs. These communities aren't operating outside economics. They're creating economics from the ground up, based on lived realities rather than theoretical abstractions. He displayed a final slide, a comprehensive model integrating his observations with existing economic theory, showing how conventional approaches could be expanded to incorporate these alternative frameworks. By understanding these adaptive systems, we gain insight not just into survival economies, but into fundamental questions about human economic behavior, community resilience, and the limitations of our current theoretical models. And as Thomas finished speaking, the room remained silent for several seconds, the particular silence of academic minds processing significant new information. Then Professor Harrington cleared his throat. "That was most illuminating, Mr. Reed. We'll now open the floor for questions and discussion." What followed was unlike any departmental seminar in recent memory. The questions came rapidly, challenging but engaged, focusing on methodology, data verification, and theoretical implications rather than credentials or background. Thomas answered with the confidence of someone who knew his research intimately, because he had lived it, not just studied it. Professor Wilson observed from the back of the room, allowing Thomas to defend his work without intervention. She watched her colleagues' expressions shift from skepticism to consideration to genuine intellectual engagement. By the session's end, even the most traditional faculty members were discussing potential applications and extensions of Thomas's framework. As the formal presentation concluded and the room broke into smaller discussion groups, Professor Wilson made her way to Thomas, who was surrounded by graduate students asking about his field methods. "Well done," she said simply when she finally reached him. Thomas nodded, the tension of performance gradually leaving his shoulders. "They're listening. That's all I wanted." "They're more than listening," she corrected. "They're reconsidering fundamental assumptions. That's considerably rarer." McKee, later that evening, as they walked across the quiet campus, Professor Wilson broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "The fellowship is only for 3 months," she said. "We need to discuss longer-term options." Thomas looked up at the buildings around them, structures that had once represented opportunity, then exclusion, and now occupied an uncertain place in his future. "I'm not looking to become a permanent fixture here," he said. "That's not my path anymore." "I'm not suggesting it should be," she replied. "But your research deserves development, and your methodology deserves wider application. There are ways to support that without forcing you back into traditional academic structures." She outlined possibilities: research partnerships with community organizations, collaborative grants focusing on participatory economic research, platforms for publishing findings in formats accessible beyond academic journals. "What you've begun isn't just valuable for Harvard," she said. "It's valuable for understanding economic realities that affect millions of people. The question is how to sustain and expand it without recreating the very institutional barriers you've identified." Thomas considered her words carefully. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "This was never about building an academic career for myself. It was about making visible what had been invisible." Professor Wilson nodded, understanding that his hesitation wasn't about capacity, but about purpose, about ensuring that his work served the communities it documented rather than merely extracting knowledge from them. "Take the time you need," she said, "but remember that influence requires engagement. Your insights can reshape how we understand economic behavior during crisis, but only if they reach the people who shape policy and education." As they parted ways at the edge of campus, Thomas looked back at the illuminated buildings of Harvard, a place that had rejected him and that he had rejected in turn, yet now offered an uneasy platform for amplifying truths learned far from its privileged spaces. The complexities of this new relationship were still unfolding, the tensions between institutional power and lived experience still unresolved. But something had fundamentally shifted in how knowledge was being valued and whose perspectives were being centered, a small but significant crack in the foundations of who could speak with authority about economic reality. And that, Thomas realized as he walked toward his temporary apartment, was perhaps more disruptive than any theory he could have developed within these walls as a conventional student. His interruption had become an intervention, challenging not just Professor Wilson's equations, but the very structure of who could question them. Spring settled over Harvard Yard, transforming the austere campus with tender green and cherry blossoms. For most students, it marked the familiar rhythm of approaching finals and summer plans. For Thomas Reed, it represented something entirely different, a full season spent reintegrating into an institution that had once been beyond his reach. The visiting scholar apartment had become more than just shelter. Its walls were now covered with elaborate charts, tracking economic patterns across various marginalized communities. The dining table had disappeared beneath stacks of academic journals, newly relevant as Thomas connected his field observations to existing literature. The small living room had been transformed into a makeshift lecture space where graduate students now gathered weekly to learn methodologies that no formal course offered. 2 months into his 3-month fellowship, Thomas had established an uneasy presence at Harvard. Not quite faculty, not quite student. He occupied a liminal space that challenged conventional academic categories, much like his research challenged conventional economic frameworks. Professor Wilson watched this evolution with a complex mixture of pride and concern. The department's seminar had been a turning point, granting Thomas intellectual legitimacy that even skeptics couldn't entirely dismiss. But legitimacy wasn't the same as acceptance, and the institutional barriers remained formidable. "We need to discuss your position," she said one afternoon, closing the door to her office where Thomas had been analyzing recent data. "The fellowship ends in 3 weeks. Thomas looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm aware of the timeline." Professor Wilson settled into the chair across from him. "The department is divided. Some faculty want to extend your appointment indefinitely. They see the value of your methodology and findings. Others remain uncomfortable with the precedent of appointing someone without conventional credentials." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "And where do you stand, Professor?" "You know where I stand," she replied. "Your work has already transformed how I approach behavioral economics, but my opinion alone doesn't determine institutional decisions." She placed a folder on the desk between them. "There are 3 possibilities we should consider. The first option was an extension of the fellowship through the next academic year, providing stable income and institutional affiliation, but no pathway toward permanent position. The second was a specialized master's program that would allow Thomas to formalize his research while earning credentials, essentially asking him to retrofit his expertise into conventional academic packaging. Thomas listened without comment, his expression growing more distant with each carefully presented option. When Professor Wilson finished outlining the second possibility, he interrupted before she could present the third. "Both options require me to conform to systems that failed me," he said quietly. "Systems I've spent 3 years documenting the limitations of." Professor Wilson didn't immediately disagree. Instead, she studied him with the careful attention she'd come to develop. Over their months of collaboration, what would meaningful support for your work look like, Thomas? Not within existing constraints, but in an ideal scenario. The question caught him off guard. After years of navigating systems never designed for his success, the invitation to imagine something different momentarily disoriented him. "I need to remain connected to the communities I study," he said finally. "Not extracting knowledge from them for academic consumption, but creating genuine exchange. And I need institutional resources without institutional containment." He stood pacing as he articulated what he'd barely allowed himself to consider. "The people I've been living among, they're not just research subjects. They're co-creators of economic knowledge through lived experience. Any meaningful continuation of this work needs to recognize that." Professor Wilson nodded slowly. "That brings us to the third option, one I've been developing separately from departmental discussions." She opened the folder, revealing a detailed proposal unlike anything Thomas had expected. It outlined a community economic research initiative, a semi-autonomous project housed within the university but operating according to different principles than traditional academic programs. This would establish a formal pathway between community experience and academic research, she explained, creating spaces where people with lived expertise could collaborate with those holding academic credentials to develop more comprehensive economic understanding. Thomas scanned the proposal with growing interest. "This is essentially what we've been doing informally, but with institutional backing." "Exactly," Professor Wilson agreed. "It builds on your methodological innovations while addressing the limitations you've identified in academic knowledge production." What she didn't say explicitly, but Thomas understood immediately, was that this proposal wasn't just about accommodating his unusual situation. It represented a fundamental challenge to how economic knowledge was created and valued, a challenge to the very foundations of academic authority. "This won't be popular," he noted, gesturing to the section outlining community co-researchers with decision-making authority. "No," she agreed. "It won't be, but the pandemic and subsequent economic disruptions have revealed the inadequacy of our current models. There's growing recognition, even among traditional academics, that we need different approaches." She leaned forward, her typical professional reserve giving way to genuine urgency. "Your work demonstrates that economic theory developed without input from those experiencing economic precarity is fundamentally incomplete. This initiative would begin addressing that gap systematically." Thomas set down the proposal, studying Professor Wilson with new appreciation. When they'd first met in that interrupted lecture, he had seen her as the embodiment of academic insularity, brilliant but disconnected from economic realities beyond theory. Now he recognized something different, a mind capable of profound reconsideration when presented with compelling evidence. "You're proposing to restructure knowledge production itself," he said. "That's considerably more ambitious than finding me a job." She smiled slightly. "The personal and the structural are inseparable here. Your individual situation reveals systemic failures in how we develop economic understanding. Addressing only one would leave the fundamental problems intact." Over the following days, Thomas immersed himself in developing the initiative proposal, expanding sections on methodology and adding detailed implementation plans. The work energized him in ways traditional academic pathways never had, offering the possibility of bridging worlds that typically remained separate. Professor Wilson, meanwhile, began the delicate process of building institutional support. She approached key faculty across departments, emphasizing different aspects of the initiative depending on their priorities and perspectives. With economists, she highlighted methodological innovations. With social scientists, she emphasized community engagement. With administrators, she stressed reputational benefits and funding opportunities. By the third week, the initiative had gained cautious support from enough influential figures to warrant a formal presentation to university leadership. The meeting was scheduled for May 15th, precisely one day before Thomas's fellowship expired. The timing wasn't coincidental. Professor Wilson understood institutional psychology well enough to know that the looming deadline created useful pressure, forcing a decision rather than allowing indefinite deliberation. As the presentation date approached, Thomas found himself reconnecting with communities that had been part of his research, not just to gather additional data, but to ensure the initiative genuinely reflected their perspectives and priorities. On a rainy Tuesday evening, he sat in a cramped community center in Dorchester, explaining the proposal to a group of day laborers, service workers, and others living at the economic margins. This initiative would create formal roles for people with lived experience of economic precarity, he explained, translating academic language into more accessible terms. Paid positions as community researchers, documenting economic systems that develop outside formal markets. A woman named Elena, who cleaned offices overnight while raising 3 children, studied the handout with skeptical attention. "So, Harvard wants to learn how poor people survive now?" she asked. "Why? To write more books nobody like us will read." The directness of her question cut through academic abstraction. Thomas recognized its legitimacy. The same questions he had asked himself repeatedly. "That's exactly the risk," he acknowledged. "That's why I'm here asking for your input before anything gets finalized. This initiative will fail if it just extracts knowledge without creating meaningful exchange." The conversation that followed was challenging, probing not just the initiative's structure, but its underlying purpose. Community members pushed on questions of accessibility, compensation, and concrete benefits beyond academic publications. "Knowledge isn't neutral," said James, a former factory worker, now piecing together gig work after his plant closed. "Who controls what happens with what we share? Who decides which parts matter?" These questions drove substantial revisions to the proposal, strengthening sections on community governance and adding explicit provisions for translating research into accessible resources. By the time Thomas returned to campus, the initiative had been transformed by the very perspectives it aimed to incorporate. The morning of the presentation arrived with institutional tension palpable even to those unaware of what was at stake. Thomas had borrowed a suit from a departmental exchange program established for students who couldn't afford professional attire. The irony wasn't lost on him. His ability to appear credible still depended on institutional resources historically inaccessible to those he represented. The meeting room filled with an unusual mix of attendees. University leadership and department chairs occupied the central table, while other faculty and administrators lined the walls. Most surprising was the presence of several people from the communities Thomas had been researching. Elena among them, looking simultaneously uncomfortable and determined in the rarefied space of Harvard administration. Dean Roberts opened the session with practiced institutional diplomacy. We're here to consider a proposal for a new research initiative developed by Professor Wilson in collaboration with Mr. Reed. This represents an innovative approach to economic research methodology with potential implications for how we understand community economic systems. The careful framing already revealed the challenge ahead, translating radical rethinking into language palatable to institutional powers without diluting its essential purpose. Professor Wilson presented first, establishing academic credentials and theoretical foundations before introducing Thomas. Her approach was strategic, wrapping challenge in familiar academic packaging. When Thomas took the floor, he began not with the proposal itself, but with a story, the same one he had told in Professor Wilson's lecture months earlier, but now expanded to reveal its full implications. When I first observed how day laborers at pickup sites shared information about employers, pooled resources during emergencies, and created informal insurance systems, I recognized patterns that contradicted fundamental assumptions in mainstream economic theory, he explained. These weren't instances of irrational behavior under scarcity. They represented sophisticated adaptations to economic conditions rarely studied by traditional economists. He moved methodically through examples documented across different communities, demonstrating consistent patterns that revealed alternative economic frameworks operating alongside conventional systems. The rigor of his analysis was undeniable, even to the most skeptical administrators. What emerged from this research wasn't just a set of interesting anomalies, he continued. It was evidence of systematic blind spots in how we develop economic understanding, blind spots that limit our ability to address growing economic precarity affecting millions of Americans. Eleanor shifted in her seat, almost imperceptibly, nodding as Thomas articulated realities rarely acknowledged in such settings. The Community Economic Research Initiative addresses these limitations by creating structured collaboration between academic researchers and those with direct experience of alternative economic systems, Thomas explained, transitioning to the proposal itself. It establishes new pathways for knowledge exchange that benefit both the university and the communities involved. What followed was a detailed presentation of the initiative's structure, methodology, and potential outcomes, not just academic publications, but policy recommendations, community resource development, and educational materials for multiple audiences. The question period revealed expected institutional concerns about credentials, academic rigor, and precedent. But it also surfaced genuine intellectual engagement with the methodological innovations Thomas and Professor Wilson had developed. This approach challenges conventional boundaries between researcher and subject, noted Professor Chen from sociology. That raises important methodological questions, but also opportunities for developing more comprehensive understanding of economic behavior under conditions traditional research rarely captures. As the formal presentation concluded, Dean Roberts thanked the presenters with carefully measured enthusiasm. This is certainly thought-provoking. The committee will need time to consider the full implications before making recommendations. The academic equivalent of indefinite delay. Thomas recognized the strategy immediately, acknowledgement without commitment, evaluation without timeline. It was how institutions absorbed potential disruption, examining it until urgency faded and existing systems could reassert themselves. What happened next wasn't part of any planned presentation. Elena stood up from her seat along the wall. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. An uncomfortable silence followed. Community members weren't typically granted speaking roles in such meetings. Dean Roberts glanced at Professor Wilson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We'd welcome additional perspective," the dean said finally, professional courtesy masking institutional discomfort. Eleanor moved to the front of the room, standing beside Thomas rather than taking his place at the podium. "I clean your offices. At night," she began, gesturing to the administrative building around them. "Not this room specifically, but buildings like this one. University buildings where people make decisions about economies and policies." Her directness created immediate tension. This wasn't the carefully packaged community input institutions preferred, quotable but containable. This was unmediated, perspective entering institutional space on its own terms. 3 years ago, when the pandemic started, I lost my full-time job. Since then, I've worked through 3 different cleaning contractors, each paying less than the one before. I've navigated unemployment systems designed to be discouraging, food assistance programs that penalize saving, and housing supports that disappear if you work too many hours. She paused, making eye contact with several administrators. None of the economic theories taught here prepared me for this reality. But what did help was the knowledge shared among people in similar situations, which employers would steal wages, which assistance programs had hidden requirements, how to pool resources when individual income wasn't enough. Thomas watched as her words registered differently across the room. Some administrators shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with genuine attention. What Thomas documented in his research isn't abstract theory. It's how real people survive when systems fail them. And those systems fail us, partly because the people designing them don't understand the realities we face. She gestured to the proposal projected on the screen. This initiative matters because it creates space for our knowledge to shape understanding, not just as interesting stories or case studies, but as legitimate expertise that can improve economic theory and policy. Elena stepped back, her brief intervention complete, but its impact rippling through the room. She had transformed abstract community engagement into specific human reality, challenging the committee to recognize what was actually at stake in their deliberations. Dean Roberts cleared his throat. "Thank you for that. Illuminating perspective." His discomfort was evident, but so was genuine reconsideration in his expression. It certainly underscores the potential significance of this approach. As the meeting concluded, the outcome remained uncertain. Institutional processes moved at their own pace, rarely influenced by individual urgency or need. Thomas's fellowship would end the following day, regardless of the committee's eventual decision. Professor Wilson gathered her materials as administrators, filed out, engaged in muted conversations that would continue in more private settings, where real decisions often took shape. "That was quite effective," she said quietly to Thomas, "particularly Elena's intervention." He nodded, watching Elena speaking with several faculty members who had approached her after the presentation. People respond to lived reality differently than to academic theory. That's part of what this initiative recognizes. Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to the visiting scholar apartment, aware that it might be his last night there, regardless of the initiative's eventual approval. He had always understood this fellowship as temporary, a brief institutional foothold from which to advance ideas developed far from academic validation. As he packed his research materials, separating what belonged to the university from what he had developed independently, his phone rang. Professor Wilson's name appeared on the screen. "They've expedited review of the proposal," she said without preamble. Apparently, Eleanor's perspective made quite an impression on several key decision-makers. Thomas sat down, surprised by the uncharacteristic speed of institutional response. And initial approval for a 1-year pilot. Limited scope compared to our full proposal, but with core elements intact. Community co-researchers, alternative knowledge validation methods, and structured exchange between academic and experiential expertise. She paused, They've also extended your appointment to coordinate the pilot, same visiting researcher status, but with full year guaranteed and possibility of extension depending on the initiative's development. Thomas absorbed this unexpected outcome, recognizing both its significance and its limitations. A contained experiment rather than structural change, he noted. For now, Professor Wilson agreed. But experiments that demonstrate value have ways of becoming permanent, especially when they address gaps increasingly impossible to ignore. After they hung up, Thomas stood at the window of the apartment, looking out at the campus that had rejected him 3 years earlier and now offered conditional re-entry on very different terms. The initiative wasn't revolutionary on institutional scales, a small pilot program occupying minimal university resources, but on human scales, it represented something profound. Formal recognition that economic knowledge created through lived experience deserved academic engagement on equal terms. As spring evening settled over Harvard Yard, Thomas packed the last of his research notes, preparing not for departure, but for transition. The 3-month fellowship had been both less and more than he had anticipated, less individually transformative, more institutionally challenging. He had returned to Harvard not to reclaim his place within its systems, but to question how those systems determined whose knowledge mattered. The initiative's approval, however provisional, suggested that questioning had found unexpected resonance even within institutional walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, translating provisional approval into functional programs, navigating institutional constraints while maintaining community connections, building bridges between worlds that rarely acknowledged each other as equal sources of understanding. But tonight, Thomas allowed himself a moment of recognition. The homeless dropout, who had interrupted a lecture, had initiated something that neither he nor Professor Wilson could have accomplished alone. A small but significant crack in the foundations of who could speak with authority about economic reality. The Community Economic Research Initiative took shape gradually over the following months, transforming from provisional concept to living reality. What began as a small pilot program expanded as its value became increasingly difficult for even skeptical administrators to deny. Thomas Reed found himself in an evolving role that defied conventional academic categorization, part researcher, part community liaison, part institutional challenger. Autumn painted Harvard Yard in crimson and gold as Thomas prepared for the initiative's first major symposium. Unlike traditional academic conferences, this gathering would bring together university researchers, policy experts, and community members with lived experience of economic precarity. Their goal was ambitious: to develop a more comprehensive framework for understanding economic behavior during times of systemic disruption. "We're completely oversubscribed," Professor Wilson announced, reviewing registration numbers in their shared office space. What had once been a storage room in the economics building had been converted into the initiative's headquarters, modest but symbolically positioned within the institutional heart of economic theory. 300 participants confirmed. "We've had to close registration and establish a waiting list." She looked up, a rare smile crossing her typically reserved face. "Including representatives from the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department." Thomas nodded, understanding the significance. This wasn't merely academic interest, but potential policy impact. "And community participants?" 57 fully funded as specified in our revised proposal. Transportation, accommodation, childcare support, everything necessary for genuine participation. She set down her tablet. The university administration finally approved the additional budget after Elena testified to the Board of Trustees. Thomas smiled at that image. Elena, who cleaned university offices overnight, addressing the wealthy and powerful figures who governed Harvard. The persistent hierarchy was undeniable, yet something fundamental had shifted when her lived expertise was formally acknowledged as valuable knowledge. "How are you feeling about your keynote?" Professor Wilson asked, studying him with the perceptive attention that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Thomas glanced at his laptop, where his presentation notes remained unfinished. "Still wrestling with it," he admitted. "Academic language feels inadequate for communicating what we've discovered, but complete rejection of academic framing would alienate institutional participants." "That tension is precisely what makes your perspective valuable," she reminded him. "Your ability to translate between worlds that rarely communicate effectively." The symposium venue was Harvard's historic Sanders Theater, its soaring ceilings and wooden acoustics typically reserved for distinguished lectures and high-profile university events. Thomas arrived early on the opening day, watching as the ornate space gradually filled with a mixture seldom seen within those walls. Academics in professional attire alongside community members whose clothing reflected practical rather than institutional concerns. Elena found him backstage, now comfortable enough in university spaces to navigate them confidently. "Nervous?" she asked, straightforward as always. "Aware of the stakes," Thomas replied. Their friendship had developed naturally over months of collaboration, mutual respect, gradually replacing initial wariness. "Just tell the truth as we've lived it," she advised. "The fancy degrees and titles in the audience don't change what's real." The symposium opened with traditional welcoming remarks from university leadership, their carefully measured enthusiasm revealing lingering institutional ambivalence about the initiative's implications. Dean Roberts spoke of innovative methodological exploration and community engagement, language that acknowledged the initiative's existence without fully embracing its challenge to academic authority. Professor Wilson followed with a presentation, situating the initiative within economic theory's evolution, strategically framing radical rethinking in terms of scholarly precedent. Her academic credentials and theoretical sophistication created a bridge for traditional economists to approach the initiative's more disruptive elements. When Thomas finally took the stage, the diverse audience settled into expectant silence. He had come to understand that his unique position, having experienced both Harvard's rarefied intellectual environment and the harsh realities of economic displacement, allowed him to speak to multiple worlds simultaneously. 3 years ago, I sat in a Harvard lecture hall much like this one, he began, his voice steady despite the venue's grandeur. I believed then that with sufficient theoretical sophistication, we could develop economic models that accurately reflected human behavior under all conditions. He paused, looking out at faces representing dramatically different lived realities united in this unusual space. Then life intervened. My scholarship was revoked when family medical bills overwhelmed our resources. I withdrew from Harvard and entered an economic reality rarely studied by those who theorize about it, a reality of immediate scarcity, structural barriers, and systems designed to manage poverty rather than facilitate mobility. The auditorium remained silent. Institutional representatives and community members alike focused on his words. What I discovered wasn't just personal hardship, but alternative economic systems functioning beneath the surface of formally recognized markets. Systems created by people navigating scarcity with sophistication rarely acknowledged in mainstream economic theory. Thomas moved from personal narrative to research findings, presenting the initiative's work, documenting how communities develop complex resource-sharing mechanisms, information networks, and risk distribution systems when traditional economic structures fail them, These aren't aberrations or market failures, he emphasized. They're adaptive responses revealing economic principles that operate when conventional assumptions about choice, access, and rationality no longer apply. He presented data visualizations showing how these alternative economic frameworks functioned across different communities, demonstrating consistent patterns that challenged fundamental theoretical assumptions about behavior under scarcity. Traditional economics often interprets these behaviors as irrational because they prioritize community stability over individual accumulation. But what our research reveals is that these communities haven't abandoned rationality. They've developed a more contextual understanding of self-interest, where individual survival depends on collective resilience. As Thomas concluded his presentation, he gestured to community co-researchers seated throughout the auditorium. The insights I've shared today weren't developed by me alone, or even by our academic research team. They emerged through genuine collaboration with people whose lived expertise in navigating economic precarity represents sophisticated knowledge rarely valued in academic settings. He paused, making eye contact with Eleanor and other community researchers. This initiative exists not just to document alternative economic systems, but to challenge how economic knowledge itself is created and valued, to recognize that comprehensive understanding requires multiple forms of expertise, including the expertise developed through direct experience of the systems we study. The applause that followed wasn't merely polite acknowledgement, but genuine engagement, especially from policy experts who recognize the practical implications for addressing growing economic instability across the country. What Thomas couldn't have anticipated was the response from Dr. Catherine Walsh, the Federal Reserve representative who approached him during the morning break. Your presentation articulated patterns we've been observing in economic data, but struggling to interpret, she said, introducing herself with the direct efficiency of someone accustomed to influencing policy, particularly regarding resource allocation decisions during periods of sustained precarity. Thomas nodded, recognizing the significance of this acknowledgement from traditional economic power centers. We're establishing a special advisory council on adaptive economic systems during structural transition, Dr. Walsh continued. Your initiative's methodology offers a framework we've been lacking. Would you consider consulting with our research division? Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor appeared beside him, having overheard the conversation. Will this advisory council include people with direct experience of these economic adaptations? She asked, her question revealing the initiative's influence on her own institutional expectations, or only those who study them academically? Dr. Walsh looked momentarily startled, then thoughtful. That's a valid question. Our current structure doesn't explicitly include that perspective, but your point suggests a significant oversight in our approach. The interaction illustrated precisely what the initiative had been designed to facilitate: genuine exchange between different forms of economic knowledge, challenging institutional blind spots through direct engagement rather than theoretical critique alone. Throughout the 3-day symposium, similar moments unfolded as community researchers confidently engaged with academic experts and policymakers, their lived expertise increasingly recognized as essential rather than supplementary. Each conversation represented a small but significant shift in whose knowledge counted in understanding economic reality. On the symposium's final evening, Thomas found himself walking through Harvard Yard with Professor Wilson, the autumn air crisp as students hurried between buildings around them. The Federal Reserve invitation is significant, she noted, potential for structural impact beyond academic publishing. Thomas nodded, still processing the implications. If they're genuinely willing to incorporate community expertise rather than just extracting insights from it. That's the persistent challenge, she agreed. Ensuring that institutional engagement doesn't become merely extractive. She glanced at him. Your leadership will be essential in maintaining that boundary. They paused near the steps where Thomas had once sat as a homeless dropout, looking up at stars barely visible through light pollution and tree branches. Did you ever imagine this outcome when you interrupted my lecture? Professor Wilson asked, rare personal curiosity entering her typically professional demeanor. Thomas considered the question carefully. I imagined being heard, he said finally. I didn't necessarily imagine being integrated. The distinction was crucial. He had sought recognition for overlooked economic realities, not personal academic rehabilitation. The initiative's success couldn't be measured by his individual position, but by its effectiveness in challenging how economic knowledge was created and valued. Integration always risks co-option, Professor Wilson acknowledged. The question is whether it also creates meaningful change. They continued walking, passing buildings that housed centuries of accumulated academic authority and prestige. Thomas was acutely aware of the privilege these spaces represented, and of how recently they had been inaccessible to him. The university press wants to publish a book based on the initiative's methodology and findings, Professor Wilson mentioned as they neared the economics building. They're particularly interested in the collaborative authorship model with community researchers. Thomas nodded, considering the opportunity. Publication matters for institutional legitimacy, but we need parallel outputs in formats accessible beyond academic audiences. The insights belong first to the communities that generated them. His insistence on multiple forms of knowledge. Dissemination had become a defining principle of the initiative, ensuring that research findings reached academic journals, policy briefings, and community resources simultaneously, rather than filtering gradually from elite institutions outward. As winter approached, Thomas found himself increasingly dividing his time between Harvard and Washington, D.C., where the Federal Reserve Advisory Council was taking shape with his active involvement. His insistence on community representation had resulted in a restructured council that included 4 positions for those with direct experience of economic adaptation during systemic disruption. Elena was among those selected, her articulateness about economic realities rarely represented in policy discussions, making her particularly effective in challenging conventional frameworks. They still talk about us like we're anomalies, she told Thomas after a particularly frustrating council meeting where traditional economists had attempted to categorize community-based economic systems as temporary market failures. But they're starting to listen when we push back. The gradual shift in whose expertise was considered valid in economic policy discussions represented the initiative's most significant achievement, more important than academic publications or institutional recognition. On a snowy December evening, Thomas returned to his campus office after a week in Washington to find Professor Wilson waiting with unexpected news. The university has approved transitioning the initiative from pilot to permanent program, she announced without preamble, with expanded funding and formal departmental status. Thomas set down his bag, absorbing the implications. Institutional permanence brought resources and recognition, but also risks of academic neutralization, transforming radical rethinking into acceptable innovation safely contained within existing structures. There's more, Professor Wilson continued, recognizing his mixed reaction. They're establishing a new academic position to direct the program, a professor of community economic systems, and they want you to fill it. The offer represented extraordinary institutional validation, a formal academic appointment without conventional credentials, based entirely on demonstrated expertise and methodological innovation. That would require completing a doctorate, Thomas noted, familiar enough with academic requirements to recognize the procedural barriers. Not in this case, Professor Wilson replied. The appointment would be based on equivalent experience and research contribution. The Faculty Senate approved a special exception in recognition of your work's significance. The exception was unprecedented, a formal acknowledgement that valuable economic knowledge could develop outside traditional academic pathways. Yet Thomas felt immediate wariness about what acceptance might represent. I need to consider what this means, he said carefully, for the initiative's independence and for my ability to maintain community connections. Professor Wilson nodded, understanding his hesitation wasn't about personal opportunity, but about broader implications for the knowledge systems they were challenging. Take the time you need, she said, but recognize that your acceptance or refusal will shape how this work continues and who has authority to advance it within institutional spaces. That night, Thomas walked through snow-covered Harvard Yard, retracing the path he had taken as a student, then as a homeless researcher, and now as someone offered formal academic legitimacy. Each transition represented not just personal circumstance, but shifting relationships between different forms of knowledge and authority. Near midnight, he found himself outside Wallace Hall, where he had interrupted Professor Wilson's lecture nearly a year earlier. The building stood dark except for a few windows, where students prepared for final exams, their educational pathways still uninterrupted by the economic precarity that had altered his own. The professorship offer required careful consideration of contradictory truths. Institutional recognition could amplify important economic insights while simultaneously domesticating their more radical implications. Academic integration offered resources and influence, but risked separating Thomas from the communities whose realities had informed his research. No single decision could resolve these tensions. They reflected fundamental contradictions in attempting to transform knowledge systems from within institutional structures built to maintain existing hierarchies of expertise. As snow continued falling around him, Thomas recognized that whatever path he chose would require ongoing negotiation between worlds that operated according to different principles and priorities. The same tension that had driven him to interrupt a Harvard lecture, the gap between theoretical understanding and lived reality, would continue shaping his work regardless of institutional position. 3 days later, Thomas met with Professor Wilson in her office. His decision reached after consultation with Elena and other community researchers who had become essential collaborators. I'll accept the position, he said, with specific conditions that maintain the initiative's founding principles. He outlined requirements ensuring community co-researchers retained authority over how their expertise was represented and applied, guaranteeing multiple forms of knowledge dissemination beyond academic publishing, establishing clear parameters for institutional partnerships to prevent extractive relationships. Essentially, I'm accepting institutional legitimacy while refusing academic containment, he concluded. The position is valuable only if it advances broader recognition of community economic expertise, not if it simply creates an exceptional individual case that leaves systemic exclusion intact. Professor Wilson nodded, unsurprised by his approach. The exceptional individual case often serves institutional interests by appearing to address structural issues without fundamentally changing them, she acknowledged. Your conditions make that more difficult. As spring returned to Harvard Yard, Thomas Reed was formally appointed Professor of Community Economic Systems, a position created in response to his unconventional expertise and the initiative's demonstrable impact on economic understanding. The appointment received significant attention within academic circles, highlighting ongoing tensions about what constituted legitimate economic knowledge and who could claim authority to develop it. Traditional economists remained divided, some welcoming methodological innovation, others warning against diluting academic standards through exceptional appointments. What mattered more to Thomas were the effects beyond academia. The initiative's influence had begun reaching policy discussions, community development programs, and economic education materials. Its methodologies were being adapted by community organizations to document and strengthen their own economic systems. Its findings were informing more responsive approaches to economic support during periods of systemic disruption. On the morning of his first official lecture as a Harvard professor, Thomas stood at his apartment window, watching students cross the yard toward morning classes. His relationship to this institution had transformed dramatically since that first interrupted lecture. From student to dropout to critic to unexpected insider. Each transition had carried its own challenges and contradictions, reflecting broader tensions between institutional authority and lived expertise, between theoretical frameworks and experiential knowledge, between individual advancement and structural change. As he prepared to address students who would now view him through the legitimizing lens of academic appointment, Thomas remained acutely aware that his presence within Harvard's walls represented both institutional accommodation and ongoing challenge. His position existed not because systems had functionally changed, but because sufficient disruption had created space for exceptional inclusion. The lecture hall filled beyond capacity for his inaugural presentation, curiosity about the unconventional. Professor driving attendance beyond enrolled students. Thomas recognized faces from across departments, alongside university administrators and even several community researchers who had never before entered a Harvard classroom. As he approached the podium, Thomas thought briefly of the desperate young man who had interrupted Professor Wilson's lecture a year earlier. How far from this moment that version of himself had been, yet how essential that intervention had proved in challenging whose knowledge counted in understanding economic reality. Economic theory developed without input from those experiencing economic precarity will always be fundamentally incomplete, he began. The same words he had first spoken in this building, but now carried by institutional authority rather than desperate interruption. The journey from that first confrontational moment to this legitimized position contained important lessons about knowledge, power, and the persistent gap between theoretical understanding and lived reality. That gap hadn't disappeared with his appointment. It had simply shifted location, requiring ongoing navigation rather than one-time resolution. As Thomas continued his lecture, outlining the initiative's research on alternative economic frameworks during systemic disruption, he remained conscious of the delicate balance his position represented, using institutional legitimacy to challenge institutional limitations, occupying academic space to expand whose expertise shaped economic understanding. The young man who had interrupted a lecture had become the professor giving one, but the fundamental purpose remained unchanged, making visible economic realities that existing frameworks failed to capture, creating space for overlooked expertise to inform collective understanding. Professor Wilson sat in the back row, watching her former student and current colleague navigate this complex transition. When their eyes briefly met across the lecture hall, her subtle nod acknowledged not just his individual journey, but the shared project they had undertaken, challenging not only what we know about economic behavior, but how we determine whose knowledge counts in understanding it. The transformation wasn't complete. Perhaps it never could be within existing institutional structures, but something significant had shifted in whose voices could speak with authority about economic reality. And that shift, however partial, represented the beginning of more comprehensive understanding, recognition that true knowledge emerges not from isolated academic abstraction, but from genuine engagement with the complex, contradictory ways people navigate economic systems in all their manifestations. As Thomas concluded his lecture, the applause wasn't merely for an individual who had overcome extraordinary obstacles, but for the expanded understanding his journey represented. A more comprehensive economics that recognized multiple forms of expertise as essential rather than supplementary, that valued lived experience alongside theoretical sophistication, that acknowledged the limitations of knowledge developed without input from those most directly affected by economic systems and their failures. The Harvard dropout who had interrupted a lecture had initiated something larger than institutional disruption. He had helped create space for reconnecting academic knowledge with lived reality, not through rejecting theory, but through insisting it remain accountable to the complex, messy, contradictory ways economic life unfolds beyond theoretical abstraction. And in that reconnection lay the possibility of more responsive economic understanding, knowledge capable of addressing not just how economies function in theory, but how people actually experience and navigate them in all their complexity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.